Greetings. My name is Shanna O'Toole. I am the founder of Clause 40 Foundation. Our nonprofit organization is named after one of the clauses in the Magna Carta in which the promise of due process was first enshrined in document form in the 13th century. Clause 40 reads, "To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice." This kind of promise is what our unique and utterly American criminal legal system is based upon. It was an idea that deeply occupied the minds of our founding generation. They wrote it into our country's original DNA that we must protect the people, our people, from government overreach or abuse. And let me acknowledge as I reference our founders that these were deeply and morally flawed men whose views on who constituted the people excluded those who should never have been excluded. But I still credit them for this beautiful and worthy idea that built America's legal criminal framework. They envisioned a country where the oppressed would find freedom. Many of them were themselves abused by their governments, and they drafted our Constitution seeking to prevent such abuses from ever happening again on our soil. This document that today protects us all. I'm still inspired by their decisions to incorporate the promise of due process in so many different places in that document. And I'm still offended when my country falls short of those ideals. That's why I choose to play a part in addressing situations in which we fall short. Thank you for joining us this evening for an advanced screening of the third episode of Philly DA, a new docuseries from Independent Lens and ITVS. For the next several Sundays, we will continue our Sunday series on transforming prosecution. Many of our other panels in this series honestly focus on identifying those situations in which we are falling short within our criminal legal system, how it's failing us, and who that's harming. But tonight, I am thrilled to say that we will be focused more on solutions, how to do better. How do we get this right, finally? But before I introduce our special guests this evening who are going to answer those questions, I want to share that the folks who are bringing you this advanced screening would love to hear your thoughts about it. You can join the conversation by clicking on the doc scale link in our chat box or by texting the word justice to 415-223-8013. You can find that number in our chat box as well. Now on to the show. I'm very grateful for the folks who have joined us today to share their expertise. These are people, many of whom I don't personally know, have never met face to face, but I am avid readers of their work. I stalk them a bit on Twitter. And so I am thrilled to actually have them here as part of our series and to actually get to know them a little bit more face to face. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your personal Sundays with us instead of with your families and your friends. So thank you. Sajid Khan, we're going to ask him to wave, has been a deputy public defender and alternate defender in San Jose, California since 2008. Sajid and his colleague and friend Avi Singh host the incredibly awesome Aider and a Better podcast, where they talk about the criminal legal system and their lives and work as public defenders. Sajid speaks regularly about restoring the humanity of the people public defenders represent and about transformation. He is a revolutionary, and I frequently wish that I could be as cool as Sajid Khan. Kate Murphy, give a wave, is an assistant prosecuting attorney and director of the Innovative Prosecution Solutions Grant for the Jackson County, Missouri Prosecuting Attorney's Office. She's also a member of the Pretrial Research Advisory Board at Arnold Ventures. As a personal aside, I can actually say that I found her recent article in the Stanford Journal of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties a fun read, which is something I don't say a lot, but I actually highly recommend it to you. And I am thrilled that we have a prosecutor here with us today to talk to us about what to do next, how to do this better. So thank you for joining us. Sajid actually has a great piece in that same volume. So come to think of it, I'm actually recommending that all of you stay up late tonight after this series and read both of them. I promise you won't regret it. And last but certainly not least, Marc Levin is Chief Policy Counsel for the Council on Criminal Justice. Previously, Marc began the Texas Public Policy Foundation's Criminal Justice Program in 2005. And in 2010, he developed the concept for the Right on Crime initiative, to which he still serves as senior advisor. Marc was named to Politico 50 and has testified frequently on criminal justice policy before Congress and state legislatures. As I was thinking about this introduction, I thought, I don't know whether I should laugh or cry about the fact that Marc and I have been talking about what's wrong with our approach for more than 12 years, probably more than that, but I do know that I can say that I am proud to be in his orbit. And the master of ceremonies this evening is Kobie Flowers. Kobie is a trial lawyer with over 20 years of courtroom experience, litigating cases in federal and state courts throughout the US and internationally in the military commissions in Guantanamo Bay. His background as both a federal civil rights prosecutor and an assistant federal public defender provides him with uncommon insight into trial practice. In his lifelong effort to end mass incarceration and police brutality, Kobie also represents the wrongfully convicted, and he sues police departments. He is a proud board member of NECDL, and unbeknownst to him, Kobie is in fact my spirit animal. He's also promised that he will only keep us talking until 9 p.m. if the talk tonight is real and still going hot. So I, for one, have some pretty high expectations about what we're about to hear. Kobie, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction, and welcome to the panelists. That was a great episode that we just watched, and I guess the first question really comes out of sort of a unspoken theme in episode 3 of Philly DA, and that is this idea that unless we give the death penalty to the accused for the officer, then somehow there's going to be kind of open season on the Philly police officers, right? There's always this idea that unless we do something carceral or worse, the death penalty, that doing something less than that doesn't really make us safe. And so what I want to do is come to you first, Kate, and just ask you, what are we to do kind of with the fears of the public, whether they be the police department or other kind of sectors in the public, when you bring to them a solution which is non-carceral in nature? So many people, again, in the public feel that, look, we've got to lock people up, we have got to incarcerate people, and if we don't, somehow public safety will suffer. So there's this very real fear from various sectors in the public. And so I ask you, Kate, kind of what do we do with that fear? And also, given that you are a prosecutor and you work for an elected prosecutor, how does that person deal with that fear, an elected official? So I cede the floor to you, Kate.
Thank you, Kobie, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this discussion. It's a pleasure. First of all, what I heard in some of the rhetoric in the episode was this false logic of exactly what you mentioned, was equating the death penalty with safety, which certainly makes no sense when the options in the episode were life in prison or the death penalty. So it had nothing to, from a logical perspective, there was no public safety hook. But the other false equivalency also was this idea that if the perpetrator is not killed, then the victim's life was not worth anything. I think the former DA had said that in a segment as well. So that sort of false logic should not be peddled by public servants. It should not be peddled by the state. The state can offer better solutions or more reasonable answers than fear, really, which is what they're doing with the death penalty discussion in particular. I think those are difficult conversations because people are afraid, and so it has to be addressed. But I think part of it also is understanding there's a lot more research now about who does we know better who reoffends and what reoffense looks like, who's at risk for recidivism, what are other things that we can do, what are programs and rehabilitation that are actually much more effective at stopping recidivism than prison. In fact, what is it? If prison were a rehabilitation program, or if we treated it and looking at its outcomes of recidivism as a rehabilitation program, it would be the worst one we've ever conceived of.
Right. And let me just ask you, Kate, again, just as you think through, how do people get reelected? I mean, for example, Larry Krasner is going to be looking at, well, now I've got, the fraternal order of police who are going to be very, very strongly against me because of, his decision in the Robbie Wilson case. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Kate? Just again, being, in Missouri with a very obviously talented prosecutor there in Gene Peters Baker, who was elected, and putting forth, as you have done, Kate, programs that are non-carceral, whether it's the neighborhood accountability boards that you've been a part of or other restorative justice programs. How does that kind of affect, elected officials, and how can they kind of explain to people that, hey, we're not incarcerating people, but you're still safe?
Right. Well, I mean, I think this goes to culture change, and public officials, elected officials, are part of leading that. They're not only responsive to the people, they're also part of leading the people towards better solutions and explaining why those are better solutions. It's certainly true, not just historically, but presently. There are prosecutors who only speak in terms of convictions and sentence lengths. But there's also a lot of really positive movement, I think, of people who are taking a broader perspective of the system, which does not mean sacrificing safety, but it is explaining to people that there are other solutions, and that there are so many people that the criminal justice system affects, and therefore so many outcomes that we should be focused on, aside from the number of years that an individual is spending in a prison.
Right. And Sajid, I want to come to you, and then we'll finish up with you, Marc. Sajid, what's your experience of being a public defender, representing poor folks, brown and black folks, and yet dealing with survivors of crime who will come to you and understand what racism looks like, and understand what sexism looks like, and understand kind of all the things that are part of our criminal legal system, and yet they still say to you, Sajid, listen, I want to see this person who committed a violent crime, I want to see them incarcerated. How do you deal with their fears, their concerns, Sajid, as a public defender, kind of boots on the ground there, representing these folks who again are even though they want to see people go to jail, oftentimes it's their community that's going to jail?
Yeah, the first thing is a commitment to recognizing the humanity of every person present in a courtroom. The accused, the victim, the family members of each. For every person that is accused of a crime, there's a family and a community that they represent. For every victim or survivor of crime, there's a family or community that's impacted. And so there first has to be a commitment to acknowledging the humanity of all involved. And when we think about prosecutors, sometimes there is a misperception that prosecutors represent the victims of crimes or the survivors of crime. Prosecutors have a duty to all people in our community, including victims and survivors of crime, including those accused of crimes, especially those accused of violent crimes. When we broaden the lens of who the people or who the prosecutor represents, and when we include those accused of crimes, then the perspective or the lens changes. And so, of course, victims of crime, survivors of crime their pain is valid. We have to acknowledge that those who have suffered harm, that we are not in a position to diminish or reduce or negate the suffering that they have occurred. We can hold those truths. And then we can also say we are going to recognize the dignity and humanity of those accused of crimes or convicted of crimes, and say and ask ourselves with true curiosity, why did this happen? Why did this crime occur? And what is the intervention or solution to why this crime occurred that will not only help the accused not reoffend and not hurt themselves and hurt others, but it'll also provide healing, ultimately, to a degree, to survivors of crime, and ultimately make our communities safer. When you look at the example in the episode, we didn't hear about the two young men who were accused of the homicide. We didn't hear about who they were, what their stories were. We probably can assume, as you might know, Kobie, representing people in the system, that they too were victims of crime at some point, that they too were victims of police brutality or of systemic racism in some shape or form, or victims of the school to prison pipeline, that something drove them to be so desperate and brazen that they went to a GameStop to stick it up with guns. So then what's our answer? Is it to just kill them and then think that that is doing justice to the deceased and their family? Or is it to try to understand what the root causes of their crimes were and try to ameliorate those root causes, not only for those that were accused and committed those crimes, but so that we can proactively prevent those crimes from happening in the first place? No one wants police officers to die and be killed in the way Officer Wilson was killed. How do we as a community, as district attorneys, as leaders of systems, zoom backwards and say, what could we have done as systems to prevent those young men from ever arriving at that GameStop in the situation under the circumstances they were? That is promoting true public safety. That is restoration. And that is honoring survivors of crime, because we're trying to prevent them from being survivors in the first place.
No, I appreciate the point there, Sajid, and we're going to get to kind of that issue of how the accused really were nowhere in this story. I mean, we know obviously about the victim, Officer Robert Wilson. We know his nickname, Robbie. Can't tell you the name of the two accused, and that certainly was not lost on me, and I see it wasn't lost on you. But turning to you, Marc, from the conservative part of the aisle, how do we reach kind of those conservative folks, Marc, who, again, all they see is, like, if I'm not locking people up and engaging in mass incarceration, then anything short of that is not a solution. Anything short of that is a solution that I'm afraid of. So, Marc, from kind of being a policy wonk from the conservative side, how do we meet those people's fears about, again, non-carceral solutions?
That's a great question. And I really think Sajid's comments hit on it. There's a false dichotomy between personal responsibility and, on the other hand, recognizing social causes of delinquency in youth that then often lead to criminal activity. And that those social causes include, of course, someone's upbringing in terms of the environment they're in. Do they feel like they have to join a gang in order to protect themselves? You know, this study in New York City showed most of the young men in some of these communities that were carrying guns, they felt like they had to protect themselves. That's why they were carrying, what were illegal guns. And so I think that there's this tendency to say that of course everyone believes there ought to be accountability, which is different than punishment, but that doesn't mean that we don't look at the social factors that, and by the way, you can change the environment. I mean, a simple thing they're doing in Dallas to prevent crime is putting street lighting in. Every community should have that. And then, I think the other thing is, you asked about the tension between public safety, but, of course, the alternative here was life without parole, right? So that wasn't going to be an issue. And, I also look at the other end of the spectrum, where we just saw this landmark study on prosecution of low-level misdemeanors in Suffolk County. And of course, Rachel Rollins was in the video, but it basically showed that the criminal justice system is itself criminogenic in many cases, that you take someone who's low risk for a minor misdemeanor, you put them in jail for several nights, and they lose their job. They get a lifetime criminal record, which we're trying to address through things like clean slate, but in many cases, a lifetime criminal record, and it makes it harder for them. They're actually much more of a risk than they were before they came into the system for a very minor issue. And of course, the study showed that those who are not prosecuted in some alternative, or in some cases nothing should be done, but in some cases it ought to be restitution, community service, other interventions actually led to better public safety, less crime in the future. So, and I think that also overlaps with the whole issue of police defunding, which is kind of a false phrase, because I mean, what we're really talking about is a broader toolbox. So that individuals that have a mental health issue, that can be dealt with by another someone else other than a police officer. In many cases, it doesn't mean we don't need police. But again, every case, there's a phrase: if all you have is a hammer, every problem's a nail. Well, not every case requires a police intervention or prosecution, and there's nothing wrong. In fact, we need to take a much broader approach.
Yeah.
And go ahead, please jump in, Jay.
Just follow up, and thank you for bringing up nuance in crime. We just talk about crime or the system. There's such a broad range of offenses and behavior, and so there are cases where perhaps for public safety, an individual has to be removed from the street for a period of time. But there are also cases where they absolutely do not need to be removed from civil society, and there are other solutions. And the state and the system must have the flexibility and the broad toolbox, as Marc mentioned, to address the specific crime and circumstance that is before it.
No, that's a really very, very good point, Kate, that let's not lose nuance. But for purpose of tonight, I actually want to lose nuance. And I want to talk about the really tough cases. We're talking about violent crimes, right?
But even violent crimes are so different. Yeah, I mean.
No, it's a really great point. And it's a really great point. And I'm going to, come back to that point, because I want to talk to you about the Sam Gillis case, and because that was a violent crime, right?
Yeah.
Right. So but for our purpose, I think it's a more interesting discussion, and particularly for the folks that are kind of joining us, to really talk in terms of the violent crimes. I think if we can solve kind of that issue, then the other stuff almost flows. If you guys will give me a little bit of license to, again, just kind of cabin us there to talking about non-carceral solutions to really, really might be overstated, but to violent crime. And so just go ahead, Kate, jump in.
No, I mean, we have to talk about violent crime if you want to talk about mass incarceration, because that's the majority of incarcerated individuals.
Right. No, well said. And so let me move us to maybe our second question, and I'm going to come to you, Marc, with this question, but let me set it up this way. Let me set it up maybe with just two words from tonight's episode, and that's Constance Wilson. You'll remember Constance Wilson was the grandmother of Officer Robert Wilson, right? Constance Wilson was the African-American woman so concerned and so focused that there be a death penalty put on the table for the people who murdered her grandson, that she left the hospital bed, to make it to a court appearance. And so, even with kind of African Americans, I think the statistics are clear that you have a lot of African Americans who are pro-death penalty, which is typically kind of seen as a kind of conservative political position. And so that's why I want to come to you, Marc, and ask, kind of from the conservative side of the aisle, how do we reach the Constance Wilsons of the world in dealing with their feelings for retribution or revenge or some type of carceral punishment? How do we deal with, and she certainly is a survivor of this crime, right? How do we deal with those survivors who are very, very clear that, look, I want to see somebody in a cage? What say you, Marc Levin?
Well, I think Sajid hit it on the point a bit earlier, that we have to look at the fact that, I mean, it is true statistically, right, that the death penalty has been much more likely to be administered when it's a white victim as opposed to a black victim, for example. And so some of it may stem from that, the racism in our history and in our present, right, that of course caused African Americans to continue to get longer sentences for drugs and other things after you adjust for every other factor. This is not the U.S. Sentencing Commission. This is not a radical idea. It's proven, right? But it's also true on the other side of the ledger that white victims would wind up with, you'd end up with a harsher sentence when you have a white victim and, for example, a black perpetrator. And so I think that now the solution, right, isn't to just execute more people. We all know that with the death penalty, we've had many people sent to death row who turned out to be innocent. And I think the broader issue is really, if you compare us to like Western Europe, for example, for violent crimes in Western Europe, and I took a tour of prisons in Germany, it was a total revelation. It looked like a college dormitory. The people incarcerated there prepared their own meals, picked out the ingredients, picked out their books. They were supposed to be, the idea was a parallel universe. They had autonomy to prepare themselves for the real world. But the broader point is, yes, they don't take a punishment for punishment's sake, a retributive approach. It says in their statute and constitution, the sole purpose of prison is reintegration, to prepare people to come back to society in a safe and better position than when they entered. And so I think that we have to just kind of course, one point of the criminal justice system is the whole purpose of making things crimes is that we're in moral condemnation of that activity, as well as obviously an intervention to protect the public. But I do believe that, that executing someone, it's more of a reflection on us than that individual. And as a society, you know, that we having the government kill people is fundamentally problematic. And of course, it's also turned out to involve many mistakes in terms of forensics, witness ID, where we wind up having the wrong person potentially executed. So, but I totally understand the emotions behind it. But and I think that, you know, there's programs like Common Justice that have had amazing, even in violent crime cases like assaults, where they bring the victim and family to meet with the accused and really have been able to get a sense of closure and a reassurance that it won't happen again, explanations of why was I the victim. And there's answers oftentimes that a victim or a family want that only the accused can provide. So I think the evidence also shows restorative justice programs like victim offender mediation, reduce recidivism as well. So I would point to those programs, which, you know, of course, are very common in New Zealand, is almost the default, but they are fairly, a few hundred of them, particularly in the juvenile system in the United States.
No, I appreciate that answer there, Marc. I mean, you know, kind of getting to the Constance Wilsons by, you know, maybe talking about, you know, the racism in the system, particularly with respect to the death penalty, the many mistakes that are made, and you know, maybe if we could get Constance Wilson over to New Zealand, then that might, you know, change hearts and minds too. Jump into you, Sajid. Same question, but I want to frame it maybe a little bit different for you, Sajid. I mean, if you could maybe explain to the people that experience that I'm sure you've had, where you've represented someone accused of a violent crime and you're able to get to one of the survivors and talk to them about perhaps why incarcerating this person or doing something you know, very, very retributive is not the right move. And then perhaps you're able to, you know, take that person over to the DA's office, right? And say, hey, look, here's the survivor of this crime. You know, he is no longer advocating for my client to be put into a cage. Have you had that experience or similar experience? I mean, how do you turn, Sajid, kind of the person who is really hell-bent on putting somebody in a cage because they are, you know, the victim or the survivor of a violent crime? Talk to us, Sajid.
I mean, I started my comments earlier with a commitment to humanity. And I think that the first step is to peel the layers back of those accused of violent crime. I have represented people in our system for the past 13 plus years. I have sat with people in our jail and sat next to them in courtrooms who have been accused of the most serious, heinous, violent crimes that one can think of, homicides, sexual assaults, child molest, things like that. What I have learned is that every person has a story. There is always a story, there is always context that helps us understand the conduct. What I have also seen and understood is that so many of the people I have represented, especially those accused of really violent, gruesome homicide crimes, were victims themselves during their childhood and adolescence of violent crime, or lived in neighborhoods where that type of violence was normal and commonplace, and or they were young people when they committed the violent crime themselves. They weren't fully formed adults. They were 18, 19, 21, 22, and haven't even achieved their fully formed brain that would allow them to make mature, thoughtful decisions that we generally expect of people. And so when we are able to, again, commit to seeing the humanity of all involved, we can honor the pain and suffering of someone like Miss Wilson, who lost her grandson without justification, and we can hold her and accept and acknowledge her pain. We can also at the same time say that we are not invalidating her pain by looking at the humanity of the accused or the convicted, and trying to create a path forward for redemption for them. That, as Brian Stevenson says, that none of us should be defined by our worst moments. And I know that to be true, having sat next to people that have done terrible, brutal things, but also recognizing their overall tapestry of their humanity. And I think when we attempt to do that as a system, when we cultivate that humanity, it is less likely that someone like Miss Wilson is going to want the blood of the two men that killed her grandson. It is more likely, one would hope, that she might have a degree of compassion or a degree of mercy, not to say that what those young men did to her grandson was okay, but to say it's done, this pain is there, I want you to see my pain, I want you to honor my pain, but we're not gonna compound pain with more pain. We're not gonna kill two people and leave wreckage in their wake, in their families and in their communities, just perpetuating the cycle of pain. We're gonna be bigger than that and actually try to resolve and solve this pain cycle. And to that point, when we think of, as Marc just alluded to, we can't keep feeding the machine. This mass incarceration machine, the machine of the death penalty and capital punishment, it lives on the bodies and the lives and the blood of Black people in our country. It has done so for centuries. And unfortunately, the you do the crime, you do the time mentality, it has seeped into all of us, including into, I'm not blaming her, but including someone like Miss Wilson, where her first instinct is retribution. Her first instinct is punishment and condemnation, and that culture runs deep. And so it really requires, as Kate said, for prosecutors to be real thought leaders and culture changers, and saying enough is enough. This pain cycle must end, and we're not going to keep feeding this machine that ultimately preys on again Black and brown people, and we're going to do something different. And I would hope that when we approached it with that lens and with that perspective, that we might be able to convince someone like Miss Wilson, who has suffered the greatest harm, to just pause and say, you know what, maybe we can do things a different way, and to honor Mr. Wilson, and also to protect the next Mr. Wilson from being victimized in the first place.
Sajid, your comments really take me back to the episode and Movita Johnson Harrell's kind of position as the chief of the Victim Services and Restorative Justice Unit. She too was a survivor. And when we look at Constance Wilson and who was talking to Constance Wilson, it was really the FOP. And, in the episode, we never saw, perhaps, had Movita been able to speak with Constance, maybe there would have been a change, because that humanity that you talk about, maybe she would have been able to see the humanity and even, the people who had kind of perpetrated this terrible crime against her grandson. Jumping back to you, Kate, to kind of take us home. You've got this incredible story of kind of these neighborhood accountability boards and the Sam Gillis story, where and I'll let you tell it better than I can, but the take home of that story and why it's relevant, I think, to this question, Kate, is that ultimately the victim participated in the process, but first didn't participate in the process, right? First kind of was, I might be overstating this, but was more of a Constance Wilson in that, I'm going to be a little, I want not to be a part of this, but then really became a part of the process. And so maybe you can talk really from, your experience in that case or other cases about how you've been able, Kate, to take survivors or help survivors, go from a place of maybe not in the Sam Gillis case that they wanted retributive justice, but certainly they didn't want to participate in the restorative justice process. And you were able to, or at least the people that you were working with, I imagine you kind of had a lot of Movitas that you were working with on this neighborhood accountability board, who were able to move the survivor in that case, again, from not really wanting to participate in the process to participating in the process and the news covering it. And so talk to us a little bit, Kate, about how, we can move survivors from really wanting retributive justice or carceral solutions to non-carceral solutions that deal more with the humanity of the accused. Your floor is yours, Kate.
Well, I mean, it's one of the themes that really was preeminent for me in the episode was how unsatisfying the system was for the Wilson women. That there was just nothing there for them. I really appreciated the victim advocate, and she came in a little bit later after the family had already been used as pawns in the system. So their pain ended up being compounded, is what I saw. So Kobie, you mentioned I run a neighborhood accountability board, and I'll just say quickly it's made up of community members who actually live in neighborhoods that experience a lot of crime. So they have skin in the game. And it's also, if we think that justice is a combination of mercy and accountability, which may look like punishment sometimes, but accountability, it's the people who are living in those neighborhoods that are in the best position to give that, right? Because they understand, they have been victims themselves, but they also understand the pain that is wrought by the system when people go away to jail, and they know they just have more information than a prosecutor does with a thin file on her desk. So anyway, so the whole premise is that of a limited number of cases, we would turn over to a neighborhood accountability board who is trained by a local restorative justice organization. And then the restorative justice organization worked with them to meet with the individual. And we did it completely outside of the system. So there are, like, Common Justice runs some that are in connection with their charges are pending. For our pilot, we completely dismissed the charges, or we never filed the case, so that the person would not have any mark on their record. We also did it with, at first it was, we wanted the victim's consent, or it didn't have to necessarily be support, but consent. Although, as Sajid mentioned, we represent the Commonwealth. We represent everyone. So we don't represent the victim. And so if there was a case where the victim was not fully on board, you know, but we still felt like the Neighborhood Accountability Board was the best resolution for the case, we would go ahead and divert the case. I never did it against the strenuous objection of the survivor, but I did in the case that I'll talk about quickly. I did do it in a case where I really couldn't get the victim to sign on, but he wasn't pounding the table against it. So anyway, there was a case where a man had been out drinking one night, and on his way home, he stopped at there's a homeless shelter where people would sort of gather in the parking lot. It was a very social place. And he just randomly assaulted one of the individuals who worked at the homeless shelter. And the individual had a deviated septum and had a few surgeries. So it came to our office. I didn't charge it, but it was charged correctly under Missouri statute as a first-degree assault, which carries with it a 10-year mandatory minimum. And so I was watching the suspect's statement, and this man, he was so intoxicated he really couldn't remember it, but he was putting it all together, and he's, you know, he said, I really think I did this because I woke up and my hand was swollen. And he was absolutely the portrait of remorse. He said numerous times that he just wanted to apologize. Can I please apologize to this man? He also gave a very cogent, self-reflective explanation of why he did it. It was honestly, it was remarkable. I mean, talk about seeing the humanity in people, Sajid, like both this individual and the victim were both just extraordinary humans. So anyway, so it was a great case for the Neighborhood Accountability Board. And it turned out that the individual, so he was in his early 40s, maybe he's 43. He had a violent history, which he talked about. He was caught up, he's like, I made bad decisions. I hurt a lot of people. He spent 5 or 6 years incarcerated. He had actually been charged with second-degree murder, but it had been lowered. So it ended up, he had a prior violent assault, which is a bad, you know, most people, you look at that and that's a tough history. Although to me, it had been 15 years prior, 20 years prior, and the man had no police contacts in the interim. And, you know, I was listening to an individual who was truly sorry for what he did. And his first concern was the victim, honestly. So we sent it to the Neighborhood Accountability Board. And then I kept trying to call this victim because I said, you know, because the former defendant, Mr. Gillis, really wanted to apologize. And I know that that's satisfying for everyone. So I kept trying to get a hold of the victim, and the victim finally showed up. And we had Van Jones from CNN had wanted to cover it. And he had to cancel at the last minute. So some local media came in, and it was just this like remarkable, heartfelt apology from the defendant, but also, both just gracious men. And it was not something, you know, both of them said they felt grateful, and it was a rare and wonderful outcome, and done in part because they were both extraordinary individuals. And we don't have to go into this, but the defendant waived his Miranda rights and gave me all of the information to make a really informed, competent decision. So, I mean, that's another, I write about this and will continue to write about this, but it is a problem, right? When we, that he had to waive his constitutional rights in order to get the benefit. But Anyway, but he did so, and I was able to really identify him clearly as someone that the traditional system had absolutely nothing to offer him. And instead we got a great outcome for everyone.
And let me just ask, Kate, the survivor in that case, was it just a function of just difficult to find the person? I know that he was a social worker at this homeless shelter, and perhaps it was just difficult to find the person, or was it, that the person didn't want to be involved in the process? Was it something else? I mean, how did you kind of go from, again, that not a ton of participation to?
Yeah, I think it was both. He was incredibly hard to get a hold of. His voicemail box was full for like months. So
I know the feeling.
I just kept trying, and then he did say at first, he was very angry, and why did this happen to me? It was random. And it was, not an act to be condoned. He was just standing in a parking lot and got assaulted. And this was a person who was a helper and, worked with men who were struggling. So the victim also, though, he had said that he had been a heroin addict for 10 years and was really humble, gracious about understanding that people make bad choices. He said, I did a lot of really terrible things to people, and people gave me a second chance. So yeah, he was so open then too.
Kobie, can I jump in? And
of course, please do, Sajid, please.
One thing that I think is important for us to talk about is Kate's experience with these two people, the survivor and the accused, is an aberration in my experience. It's oftentimes district attorneys, in my experience, don't actually talk to victims except to coordinate their scheduling for testifying, but don't actually sit with them face to face and understand what harm they've suffered, what they believe justice could and should look like for them, what they actually need for their restoration, for their healing. And it could be as much as an apology. It could be, seeing that the accused is getting the services and interventions that they need so that this doesn't happen to someone else again. In fact, District Attorney George Gascon in LA published or highlighted a survey of survivors that indicated that most survivors don't actually desire retribution, that they actually request healing and restoration and services so that crimes don't occur again, and that being something that they actually desire. So again, when we take a moment to step back and reassess the way our district attorneys' offices operate, the culture within which they operate, and whether they truly are centering victims and their needs, and in the process, as opposed to just seeing them as a witness or exploiting their pain to secure a conviction or a long-term prison sentence or a death sentence, then we'll see potentially very different outcomes, and we'll see a real honoring of victims. And then the last thing I'll say is this idea that let's not pretend we listen now. It seems as if we only want to listen when someone like Grandma Wilson wants the worst case scenario, when she wants the death penalty. But we as district attorneys or as a community are less likely to listen when it's the mother of police officer Wilson's children who don't want the death penalty or don't want the maximum penalty, or in other cases where victims of domestic violence may not want a stay away order for their loved one, or may not want a felony conviction for their loved one because it might result in further harm to their family. And so oftentimes it's almost as if district attorneys, in my experience, have kind of selective hearing when it comes to what victims want, as opposed to really hearing the full medley of what victims and survivors desire, and then attempting to honor that in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, no, and I think it's also important.
Jump in, Marc.
Oh, yes, the victim services should be available whether the case is prosecuted or not.
Yeah, that's very important.
Or not. You know, in some instances, the victim doesn't want a case to move forward. In some instances, witnesses or evidence are unavailable. So that's really critical because, you know, dealing with the trauma is something that many victims need assistance with. You know, I think the other thing that's, you know, when you get back to kind of looking at the humanity of the defendant, which Sajid has really raised, I think that's one of the reasons that where we're seeing some success in the policy area is with special population. So, of course, second look for those convicted as juveniles, which just passed the House, Texas House, and of course, Maryland legislature just overrode a veto on, but also those with mental health issues. There's, you know, and then veterans courts taking cases involving violent offenses. So, but it's harder, you know, just when, you know, to broaden that out to all defendants, to being willing to take a look at, again, and there's a difference between an explanation and an excuse. But, you know, when you look at something like the death penalty, people on the right are saying the government can't deliver the mail, but you're going to trust them with making the gravest decision with all of the, not just the,
Marc.
Yeah, not just the evidentiary issues we talked about earlier, but just the vagaries of a jury or a judge in deciding. There's such, you know, you could find equally heinous cases where capital punishment isn't administered or invoked. So there's also a real randomness to which cases, you know, in addition to the disparities we discussed earlier. So I think those are some of the things that we just have to continue to focus on.
Great points by everybody, and I wish we had more time, but we're running, you know, close to the end of the hour, and Shana hasn't cut us off yet. So I think that perhaps we could have kind of that one last question, and then I think it'll be a wrap. And I want to frame up kind of that one last question this way, but actually kind of going back to the episode and remembering the role of Assistant District Attorney Lisa Harvey. Okay, everybody will remember her. She was the chief of the juvenile unit for 23 years. And ultimately, by the end of the episode, she resigns from that position. Larry Krasner and kind of his deputy Liftonby kind of, you know, ease her out of that position, and she goes, you know, to family court. And as she's leaving, you know, that position to go into family court and do something else, she says the following about Larry Krasner and the office. And I want us to listen to this quote, and then I'm going to follow up with a question. She says, quote, "We can't hire people who don't believe in jail, who don't believe in convicting a person," end quote. Can't hire people who don't believe in jails, who don't believe in convicting a person. That's what this 23-year veteran had to say about change. And the last question I want to ask you all is this. You looked at the criminal legal system as kind of a big Jenga block tower. And you had to figure out what block of that Jenga tower you could pull out, and then the entire criminal legal system would fundamentally change. What block would each of you pull out of that Jenga tower? And I look at, you know, and the reason I wanted to bring up Lisa Harvey is because I think she would look at that Jenga tower, and she's been there for 23 years. She was there with Lynn Abersom. She was there with Seth Williamson, and now she's there with Larry Krasner. And she was even one of the people that kind of hung on. You know, she was one of the last people to kind of be pushed out. I think she looks at that Jenga tower of the criminal legal system, and she doesn't really move any blocks that would fundamentally change the system. And so I ask kind of each one of you, which block in that criminal legal system would you pull out such as you fundamentally change the criminal legal system? We'll start with you, Marc.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to say plea bargaining, though I don't think we can pull it out entirely. I don't think it's practical. But, you know, here's the thing. If defendants weren't entering into pleas, then the system would grind to a halt. And actually with COVID, with courts being closed in many places, it has ground to a halt anyway. And what's been notable, obviously, it's heartbreaking that violent crime has gone up since over the course of the last year. And there's myriad different potential reasons for that. We don't fully know all of them. You know, some of the most effective violence interruption programs have been stymied by the lack of in-person interaction. But, you know, property crime is
good point, Marc.
And other types of crime. And so what's interesting is despite the fact that nobody's cases aren't moving forward, it doesn't seem like that if you believe that what we were doing in the criminal justice system was so important from a deterrence standpoint, you'd expect property and crimes across the board to be skyrocketing, which is not what's happened.
Point,
so
Marc.
I think that we do need to really roll back the trial penalty, which is when people get hammered, both in the federal and other systems, for not taking a plea deal. And I'm actually on the task force of the ABA, and we're going to have some recommendations that I think will at least, you know, when you look at the difference between us and Europe, for example, it's not just that ours is 90% plus pleas, but also the magnitude of the differential between what you get if you go to trial and lose and what the sentence you get for plea. So we need to make sure those plea offers are disclosed, and there has to be a compelling reason why the sentence should exceed the last plea offer. So I would say that's a critical one.
All right, Marc. So you took out 2 blocks: plea bargaining and trials, allowing folks to go to trial more. Those are the 2 blocks you take out of that the big Django block of the criminal legal system. I'm coming to you next, Kate. What are your blocks?
Yeah,
you
Marc,
get one, unlike Marc.
One I was thinking of was less plea bargaining. The more cases should go to trial is better for everyone. But I think the other thing I would say, you know, what I've seen in my time working in the system is, you know, Marc had also mentioned, right? Like it's a system and humans are in charge of it, which means there are myriad mistakes at every, you know, I've seen prosecutors make mistakes. I've seen defense attorneys do terrible work. I've seen judges make mistakes, but the person who always pays for that is the defendant. And the defendants are always poor and largely Black. So I want to see some accountability shift. I don't know what that looks like exactly, but I can make mistakes and really pay no price. Even wrongful convictions, people, you know, when verdicts are overturned or convictions are overturned, frequently prosecutors pay no price for that, or defense
absolute immunity is real.
And yeah, and I'm not letting defense attorneys off the hook, because I've also really seen defense attorneys screw their clients, and also pay no price. It's just give me the next one, right? It's the assembly line that keeps moving. So I'm pulling the block of accountability, but we should all be paying the price. We should all be paying the price for mistakes in the system. One actor, the defendant, shouldn't be bearing that entire.
Well said. Well said. I don't think I've ever heard it kind of explained that way, that ultimately everyone, all the lawyers in the system can make mistakes. And for the most part, the lawyers walk free, and it is the poor Black or brown person who suffers the consequences. Well said. The accountability block you would pull. I like that. Sajid, take us home, sir. What block would you pull out of your Jenga tower to completely disrupt, change the criminal legal system in a fundamental, paradigmatic way? The floor is yours. Take us home.
I'm going to pull out the block of elected DAs that equate justice with incarceration. I'm going to pull out the block of elected DAs that believe that locking people in cages is our answer and our only answer to crime. I'm going to pull out the block of our culture that has been ingrained in all of us, which is you do the crime, you do the time. And it's following what Kate just alluded to. It is pulling out the block where we have measured accountability by months and years of incarceration. And when we pull that block out and we replace it with other elected leaders that see our community in a wholly different way, see the humanity of all the people within it, and see that incarceration is not our answer to crime. It's not our path towards public safety. We will see a wholly different Jenga block. We'll see a Jenga block that is thriving. We'll see a Jenga block that is healing and is really vibrant and really beautiful, and something that we can be really proud of. And so that's where I think it starts, is pulling out that block, that instinct of incarceration, that instinct of condemnation and punishment that lives in all of us, and that unfortunately lives in many of our top DA seats.
I mean, I couldn't have ended it even any better. Shanna, take over.
Well, in fact, I will let you end it better, Kobie, because, sir, I want to know what block you'd pull out. It was a great question. So what's your great answer?
Yeah, well, Shanna, you know, because you and I have talked about this offline, but I would pull out the block of prisons. I would abolish the prison system. I would get us closer to a place like, you know, a New Zealand. I would take the trillions of dollars that we use to incarcerate people and then to supervise them. I would use that money to build schools, to go ahead and make sure people had great jobs, to make sure that people had great health care. As Kate has talked about, and as we all know, a lot of these crimes are because we are incarcerating poverty. And so if we took the trillions of dollars that we use to create mass incarceration, incarcerate more than anybody in the world, then I really do think that we would fundamentally change the criminal legal system. So as you know, Shana, I'm a prison abolitionist, and so prisons as the block that I would pull.
Excellent, excellent. And look, I think all of us, we all have the different, I think we'd each agree with all of each other's ideas, and if we had another hour, we would come up with 20 more things to pull. I know I would. But what is interesting is that all of us are viewing pulling these blocks out and maybe seeing a system that is inefficient and harmful and punitive and racist falling, and having us all use those pieces to build something more beautiful, more inclusive, more healing, more safe, more forgiving, more mercy. And I know that that's something that we all want, that we all share. So thank you so much to Kobie and Sajid and Kate and Marc, and thank you.
Thank you, Shanna.
Several of you included the work of mentioning Common Justice in our discussions. Unfortunately, we had a panelist from Common Justice who was scheduled to be with us today, but she couldn't make it. So thank you for mentioning her work. I'm very grateful to all of you, and also to the viewers for spending your time with us. Don't forget to let us know what you thought about the episode by clicking on the doc scale link or texting justice to the number in the chat box. And please register for next week's episode and panel, where Clause 40 Foundation board member, former U.S. Attorney Brett Tolman moderates a discussion on how we transform parole and probation and supervised release systems. You know, how do we address and rethink those things, which also seem to not be efficient or humane, and not really designed, not really fulfilling the missions that I think they were designed to do. He will be joined by activist LaTonya Myers, who is actually the star of next week's Philly DA episode. So that's very cool that we have her joining us. And she will be also joined by advocate Chris Irvin from Baltimore, Aaron Haney, who is policy director at Reform Alliance and senior counsel at Dream Corps, and also Howard Henderson, the founding director of the Center for Justice Research at Texas Southern University. So until next Sunday, take care of yourselves and each other. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.